It was one of those mornings that felt too perfect to be real. The sun rose gently over the small town of Cedar Falls, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. Birds chirped above the courthouse square, where volunteers were already setting up folding chairs, banners, and a stage draped in red, white, and blue. It was Rally Day, a big event for this quiet town. The mayor had announced weeks ago that a famous state politician would be coming to speak about jobs, hope, and the future of American pride. For a place like Cedar Falls, that kind of attention didn't happen often. Families arrived early, carrying coffee cups and small flags. Children ran between rows of chairs, their laughter echoing through the air. There was a gentle buzz, the kind that only comes from small-town excitement and curiosity. Among them sat James Hollis, a quiet man with kind eyes and a faded army cap. He arrived alone just before the speeches began. He didn't come for politics. He came because he believed in showing up, for his community, for his country, for something that once felt bigger than himself. James found a seat near the middle row. He rested his cane against the chair, folded his hands, and looked toward the stage. To anyone else, he looked like an ordinary man, but those who knew him knew better. James had served 3 tours overseas. He came home with a medal and a limp that never fully healed. James wasn't one to talk about his service. If anyone asked, he'd smile and say, "Just did my part." But behind that quiet smile were memories he rarely shared. The long nights, the sound of helicopters, the faces of friends he never saw again. He loved Cedar Falls because it was peaceful. People waved. Strangers said good morning. No one looked at him like a broken man, just as James, the mechanic who helped everyone and complained about nothing. When he heard there'd be a rally, he didn't plan to attend. But that morning, something made him get dressed, button his old jacket, and drive into town. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was hope. A hope that just maybe someone would speak about unity instead of division. He sat quietly as the music started, brass instruments playing patriotic tunes, the crowd clapping along. Around him, people chatted about rising costs, schools, and the local mill closing. James didn't join in. He just listened. He had seen enough to know that sometimes you learned more by staying silent. Then came the sound that made the crowd roar. The loudspeaker crackled, and a voice announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your candidate for governor, Senator Richard Morton." The man himself walked out from behind the stage curtains with a practiced smile and perfect posture. His suit was crisp, his tie bold, and his gestures large enough to reach the last row. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. Senator Morton shook hands, waved to the crowd, and basked in their applause. He was a man who knew how to own a stage. "Good morning, Cedar Falls," he boomed. The crowd cheered louder. For the next few minutes, his speech flowed easily. Promises of better jobs, safer streets, and renewed pride. He talked about rebuilding America from the heartland up, and people nodded, some even teary-eyed. James listened too. He didn't clap much, but he admired anyone who could stand before a crowd and speak with conviction. Then, something small caught the senator's eye. That old veteran cap. Right there in the middle row, Morton paused mid-sentence. He smiled, but it wasn't the same smile. "Now, look at this fine gentleman here," he said, pointing in James's direction. "We've got a hero among us today." The crowd turned. James gave a polite nod, unsure what to do with the sudden attention. Senator Morton stepped closer to the edge of the stage. His grin widened, but his tone shifted slightly, lighter, almost teasing. "Now, sir," he said, "tell me, did you win that cap in a raffle, or did Uncle Sam give it to you himself?" A few people chuckled. James smiled faintly, not taking offense. "Earned it, sir?" he said quietly. "Oh, I bet you did," Morton replied, microphone still in hand. "And I bet the Army's still trying to fix whatever broke down after you left, huh?" This time the laughter came louder, a ripple that spread through the front rows. Some laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke or something more. James didn't laugh. He simply looked down at his hands, his face unreadable. A woman nearby glanced at him, frowning. The moment felt off, wrong somehow. Morton continued his speech, but the tone had changed. The warmth of his earlier words was replaced with something performative, a politician milking the crowd for reaction. James stayed still. The same calm he had carried through battle now shielding him in a very different kind of fight, one of dignity. As the laughter faded, the crowd's mood shifted. What once felt like entertainment now felt uncomfortable. An older man whispered, "That wasn't right." A teenager stopped clapping. Even the brass band members avoided eye contact. Morton went on as if nothing happened, talking about heroes and sacrifice, but his earlier words now echoed in the silence between applause. James quietly picked up his cane. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. He knew words could wound deeper than bullets, especially when spoken without thought. He didn't leave. He stayed, maybe out of pride, maybe out of principle, but something inside him, and in the crowd, had shifted. The camera lights caught the scene, recording more than anyone realized, and somewhere in that crowd, a woman lowered her sign, looked straight at the stage, and whispered to the person next to her. He shouldn't have said that. The story of what would happen next, how one moment would change everything, had just begun. The crowd was still laughing, that polite, unsure laughter that fills the air when people don't quite know how to react. Senator Morton chuckled too, feeding off the sound. He lifted his chin, straightened his jacket, and kept speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, still looking at James, "this man here reminds us all what service means. Dedication, sacrifice, and maybe a few missing screws." The laughter came louder this time. It rolled through the front rows like a careless wave. James didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply kept his eyes down on the ground, at the toe of his boot scuffed and dusty from years of use. The moment should have passed. It should have been just another clumsy attempt at humor. But it lingered. Something about it hung in the air, sharp and uncomfortable. The woman from before, the one who whispered, "He shouldn't have said that," now folded her arms, her face tight. A few people stopped smiling. Others looked at their phones, pretending to be busy. Morton sensed the shift, but he wasn't used to silence. He filled it the only way he knew how, with more words. "Now don't look so serious, my friend," the senator said, leaning forward with a smirk. "You know, my granddaddy used to say, you can't fight every battle, especially when you've already lost a leg in one." The laughter that followed wasn't as full this time. It was scattered, uneven. A few people laughed out of habit, others out of discomfort. James's face didn't change. His eyes stayed calm, but something inside him tightened. A quiet ache that had nothing to do with his leg. He wasn't embarrassed for himself. He was embarrassed for the man holding the microphone. He had seen pride before, in the faces of young soldiers who thought war was about glory. He knew how fragile it was. Pride without humility was a dangerous thing. James breathed in slowly. The air was heavy, thick with noise. His hands trembled slightly, not with anger, but with restraint. He looked up at the stage, his expression unreadable. Senator Morton noticed, and for a split second something flickered in his eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe defiance. But instead of stopping, he laughed again, brushing it off. "Hey, don't worry, folks, and I'm just kidding. This man's tougher than any of us, I'm sure. Right, soldier?" The word soldier hung there like an echo. It was meant as respect, but it didn't sound like it. It sounded like a label, a reminder of something the man no longer was. James nodded once quietly. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice even. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't laugh. For the first time that morning, there was quiet. Up on the stage, Senator Morton's smile faltered for the briefest moment. He could feel it, the crowd slipping from his hands. He had built his career on control, knowing when to charm, when to joke, when to roar. But this was different. This silence wasn't the respectful kind. It was judgment. Inside, he felt a twist of irritation. Why weren't they laughing anymore? It was a harmless joke, wasn't it? He looked around at the faces before him, 1,000 eyes, some frowning, some blank. The laughter that had fueled him moments ago was gone. For the first time, the senator felt small, but pride doesn't surrender easily. He tried to mask it with energy, stepping forward again, gesturing big. "Now come on, folks. We can't get so sensitive that we forget to laugh a little. This is what's wrong with America today. Everyone's walking on eggshells." A few clapped half-heartedly, but even they seemed unsure. The woman near James shook her head. "That's not sensitivity," she muttered to her husband. That's decency. Morton didn't hear her, but he could feel her energy. The disapproval in the air was almost tangible, and beneath the noise James sat perfectly still, calm, patient. His stillness spoke louder than any words could. James had spent years learning to stay calm in chaos. In war, anger clouded your judgment. Panic got people killed. And now, standing beneath a bright blue sky surrounded by laughter that wasn't funny, he drew from that same strength. He could have shouted back. He could have stood and walked away. But he didn't, because that would make the moment about him, and it wasn't. It was about something deeper. He thought about his fellow soldiers, the ones who never came home, the ones whose names were etched on stone. He thought about the men and women who couldn't stand in this crowd because of injuries that never healed, seen or unseen. He thought about what dignity meant. Dignity wasn't loud. It wasn't about being right. It was about holding your ground when others try to shake it. James looked up once more at the senator, not with anger, but with quiet pity. He saw a man desperate to be liked, desperate to stay powerful. And in that moment, he understood something that the crowd hadn't yet. The senator wasn't mocking him out of malice. He was doing it out of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of looking small in front of his own supporters. That realization softened something inside James. He sat back, his eyes steady. Whatever the man said next, it wouldn't touch him, because real strength wasn't on that stage. It was in silence, patience, and grace. The speech dragged on. Senator Morton spoke about taxes, schools, security, but his rhythm was gone. He stumbled over words, forced smiles, exaggerated his hand gestures. He felt the distance now, a gap between himself and the people he was trying to reach. James's presence, quiet and unmoving, became like a mirror he couldn't escape. Every time he glanced at the crowd, he saw disapproval reflected back. A mother with her arms crossed, a veteran in uniform staring him down, a teenager recording everything on his phone. And then, it happened. The woman who had been silent all this time finally stood up. She wasn't young, but her voice was clear when she said, "You owe him an apology." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't angry. It was calm. And that calmness cut deeper than any outburst could. The crowd turned toward her. Some nodded. Others whispered. Senator Morton froze. The camera lights blinked red. The reporters leaned forward, pens ready. He tried to laugh it off again, but his voice cracked slightly. "Ma'am, I didn't mean any harm. We were just having some fun." But no one laughed this time. Not even the band. The woman didn't sit down. She just looked at him, her arms folded. And in that heavy silence, something shifted. It was small, almost invisible. But it was real. The laughter had died. The mood had changed. The crowd had turned from amusement to awareness. James lowered his eyes again. Not out of shame, but out of peace. He had done nothing but exist. And somehow, that was enough to remind people of what respect looked like. The senator cleared his throat, forced a smile, and rushed through the rest of his speech. But everyone knew it was over. The magic was gone. When he stepped off the stage, applause came half-hearted and thin. The crowd began to drift away, murmuring quietly among themselves. And as James stood to leave, the woman approached him. "Sir," she said softly, "thank you for being here." James nodded, offering a gentle smile. "Ma'am," he replied, "thank you for saying something." They didn't need to say more. The look they exchanged said it all. The unspoken understanding between two people who recognized dignity when they saw it. As the rally ended, and the banners fluttered in the fading sunlight, one truth lingered in the air. Sometimes, the loudest voice isn't the one with the microphone. The air hung heavy over the town square. Senator Morton's words had stopped flowing smoothly, replaced by awkward pauses and forced chuckles. He could feel the mood shift, like the weather before a storm. His smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. Every movement seemed too loud, too sharp. He tried to move on to safer topics, but the silence of the crowd swallowed his words. James Hollis sat motionless, his hands resting on his cane. He wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of being made a spectacle. Tired of being a symbol people remembered only when it suited them. The senator cleared his throat, glancing around as if searching for an ally in the sea of quiet faces. "Let's give it up for our heroes, folks," he shouted. But the applause was thin, hesitant. almost mechanical. And then, where it happened, from somewhere near the back, a woman's voice cut through the air. That's enough. It wasn't shouted in anger. It wasn't dramatic. It was calm, firm, and heartbreakingly human. The kind of voice that carried conviction without volume. Every head turned toward her. She was an ordinary woman, in her mid-30s maybe. A teacher, by the look of the lanyard around her neck. She held no sign, no camera, just quiet courage. And in that instant, the sound of her words seemed to pull a thread that had been holding the whole scene together. Everything unraveled. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the flag above the stage seemed to stop moving. The crowd, hundreds of people, froze. It was as if the entire town had forgotten how to breathe. Senator Morton blinked, thrown off by the simplicity of it. He'd been heckled before, insulted, mocked, even booed. But this wasn't heckling. This was truth. The woman didn't move. She just stood there looking up at him, her eyes steady. And in that silence, something began to shift inside the crowd. People looked at one another. Strangers locking eyes, sharing unspoken understanding. They weren't sure what to do, but they felt something. A man near the front lowered his phone. An older woman reached for her husband's hand. Child asked quietly, "Why are they being mean to the soldier?" It was the kind of question adults don't answer. Because the truth hurts too much. Up on the stage, the senator forced a smile. "Ma'am, I didn't mean any disrespect," he said, voice trembling slightly. "We were just having some light-hearted fun, but it was too late." The word fun fell like a stone into a still pond. No ripples, just quiet disapproval. The woman shook her head. "Mocking a man who served this country isn't fun," she said. And with that, the silence deepened again, this time with purpose. The people of Cedar Falls weren't used to confrontation. They were small-town folk, polite, reserved, more likely to bake a pie for a neighbor than argue in public, but something about this moment touched them. Differently. They began to remember. They remembered uncles who came home from wars and never quite spoke the same again. They remembered parents who carried old photos in their wallets, folded and faded from years of pride. They remembered funerals with flag-draped coffins, folded triangles handed to mothers, the sound of taps echoing through still air. Those memories stirred in their hearts now. Slow, painful, sacred. Someone began to clap. Just once, then again it wasn't loud, not at first. But it was enough, others joined. Not for the politician, for the man sitting quietly in the middle of the crowd, holding his cane and his dignity. Senator Morton froze. He looked down, bewildered. He tried to speak, but his voice was drowned by the growing rhythm of hands meeting hands. Slow, deliberate, unified. James blinked, unsure what to do. He hadn't asked for this. He wasn't seeking attention. But as he looked around, he saw faces, kind, ashamed, grateful, and he realized something profound. They weren't just clapping for him. They were clapping for what he represented. Senator Morton's throat went dry. He had given hundreds of speeches. He knew how to win over a crowd, how to pivot, how to control emotion. But nothing in his career had prepared him for this, being quietly corrected by the people he thought adored him. He saw his reflection in a camera lens, a proud man standing above a humble one. And for the first time, he didn't like what he saw. Behind his polished exterior, something cracked. Morton thought about his own father, a factory worker who served briefly in the reserves, who once told him, "Respect is the easiest thing to give, and the hardest thing to earn." He had forgotten that somewhere along the way, buried it beneath ambition, cameras, and applause. Now, he felt exposed. He tried to speak again, his voice softer this time. "Sir, I owe you my respect. I may have spoken carelessly," but James didn't respond. He simply gave a slow nod, not out of forgiveness, but out of understanding. Because forgiveness wasn't the point. Awareness was. Morton swallowed hard, stepped back from the microphone, and for once didn't know what to say. The crowd no longer belonged to him. It belonged to something larger, to the truth of what had just unfolded. The applause grew louder. Not wild or chaotic, but steady, heartfelt, real. It rolled through the town square like a soft wave, touching everyone who heard it. The brass band, unsure of what to do, slowly began to play again. A slow, solemn version of America the Beautiful. James rose to his feet. It took effort, but he did it slowly, with purpose. He didn't wave or bow. He just stood facing the stage, his posture straight despite the years of wear. The senator lowered his gaze. For a moment, the crowd forgot politics, parties, and promises. They remembered humanity. The applause continued, not for power, but for principle. A young boy sitting on his father's shoulders raised a small paper flag. The father whispered something to him, and the boy saluted awkwardly. James saw it and smiled faintly. That, more than anything, made the pain worth it. The woman who had spoken up wiped a tear from her cheek. She didn't regret saying those 2 words. In her heart, she knew she hadn't just defended a man. She had defended what was right. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every face, every tear, every clap. But the story that would later spread across screens and headlines wasn't about outrage or scandal. It was about respect rediscovered. As the music swelled and the final notes faded, James sat back down. The applause slowly quieted. The crowd lingered in a moment of shared reflection, and above it all, the narrator's voice might have said, "Sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't begin with a shout. They begin with a whisper that refuses to be ignored." The politician left the stage quietly. The veteran stayed a little longer, soaking in the evening light, watching the flag ripple softly in the breeze. For the first time that day, the air felt lighter, not because something ended, but because something right had begun. For a long moment, the square was frozen in silence. The senator stood behind the microphone, lips parted but speechless. The woman's words, "That's enough," still echoed faintly in the air, like a bell that refused to stop ringing. Then, without warning, something extraordinary happened. It started small, a rustle of movement in the middle rows. A man rose to his feet, then another, then a woman near the front. Within seconds, people all around the square began to stand. One by one, hundreds rose from their chairs. No instruction, no command, just instinct. They weren't standing for the politician. They were standing for the veteran, for James Hollis. Some stood with hands over their hearts. Others raised small paper flags they'd brought for the rally. A few simply stood still, their faces solemn and full of quiet apology. The air changed. The same place that had echoed with laughter only minutes earlier now felt sacred. And there, in the middle of it all, James sat, stunned, motionless. Unsure what to do, he had never wanted attention. He'd spent years avoiding it. But this wasn't attention. It was acknowledgement, not for medals or titles, but for endurance, for the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. Slowly, he reached for his cane, pressed it against the ground, and stood up. The crowd erupted. The applause was thunderous, not loud in noise, but deep in meaning. It rolled across the square like a tide of respect, unstoppable and pure. Senator Morton stood frozen on the stage. His smile was gone. The color drained from his face as he watched what unfolded before him. He had spoken thousands of words that morning, crafted lines, rehearsed jokes, practiced promises, but none of them mattered now, because here in front of him truth was speaking, wordlessly. It was in the way people stood shoulder to shoulder, in the sound of hands clapping in unison, in the sight of a man rising with quiet dignity, every movement deliberate, every breath steady. The senator felt something heavy settle in his chest, not anger, not fear, but regret. He thought of his own father again, the man who taught him that respect was the root of every kind of strength. He remembered ignoring that lesson for years, choosing charm over character. Now he was watching the consequence of that choice play out in front of cameras, live streams, and phones capturing every second. The applause wasn't for him. It was a verdict. He took a small step back, lowering his microphone, and whispered under his breath, "What have I done?" James stood tall as his body would allow. His cane trembled slightly, but his eyes were clear and steady. He looked around, taking in the faces, men, women, children, all standing. He didn't see mockery anymore. He saw humanity, imperfect, messy, but good. The sound of applause washed over him like a warm wind. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't speak. He just gave a small nod, one that said thank you, but also it's all right. That simple gesture carried more weight than any speech could, because it wasn't about him anymore. It was about what he represented: every soldier who never got to come home, every person who carried invisible wounds, every human being who had been disrespected and chose dignity over anger. The cameras zoomed in. The image of James, the quiet veteran standing in a sea of people, would soon travel far beyond Cedar Falls. But in that moment, he wasn't thinking about cameras or politics. He was thinking about his brothers and sisters in uniform, about how they'd tell him, "You did good, Hollis." A tear formed at the corner of his eye. He didn't wipe it away. He just let it fall, because it wasn't a tear of pain. It was one of peace. The applause began to change. It became more rhythmic, more powerful. People started clapping in unison, not just to honor one man, but to reclaim something that had been lost. Dignity. It spread through the crowd like light through a fog. The young and the old, the rich and the poor, people who had disagreed for years found themselves unified in that single moment of shared respect. No one cared about politics anymore. They cared about principle. The senator's staff stood at the edge of the stage, their expressions heavy with realization. No campaign slogan could fix what had just happened. The rally, meant to be a show of strength, had turned into a lesson in humility. And as the crowd kept clapping, James looked up at the flag fluttering above the square. He thought of the friends he lost, the nights he couldn't sleep, the quiet battles he fought after the war. He thought about how strange it was, that after all he'd survived, it was words, not weapons, that nearly broke him today. But the same thing that saved him in battle saved him now: grace. Because grace isn't weakness. Grace is strength without noise, and now, standing under the weight of that collective respect, James understood that his silence had spoken louder than anything the senator could ever say. When the applause finally began to fade, it didn't end abruptly. It softened, like a heartbeat slowing after a long run. The crowd remained standing. No one moved. No one wanted to break the spell. Senator Morton stepped toward the microphone again, but the words caught in his throat. Every instinct told him to apologize, and not for politics, not for optics, but from the heart. He took a deep breath. "Mr. Hollis," he said quietly, his voice trembling, "I was wrong." The words hung in the air, raw, honest. James nodded once more, his expression calm. "You are human," he said softly. The senator's eyes widened, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. There was no anger, no bitterness, just understanding. And that was the final lesson, that dignity could forgive without excusing, rise without crushing, and heal without demanding anything in return. The crowd began to applaud again, this time not for James alone, but for what had just happened. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration, the kind of justice that doesn't punish. It redeems. As the sun dipped lower, painting the square in golden light, the rally quietly dissolved. People began to leave, slowly, thoughtfully, almost reverently. The woman who had spoken up earlier walked past James and smiled. He nodded in return. No words were needed. The senator remained on stage for a long time, staring out at the emptying square. He had lost something that day, his image, maybe even his campaign, but he had gained something greater: awareness. And James, the man he had mocked, had reminded everyone of something deeper than politics or pride. As the last of the crowd drifted away, the narrator's voice might have said, "In a world too loud with ego and noise, respect still speaks in silence." And when people remember what that sounds like, hearts change. Quietly, completely, the flag waved softly above them. Catching the last light of day, James turned to leave, his cane tapping gently against the pavement. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The crowd had already spoken for him. Cedar Falls woke to a silence that felt almost sacred. Dew clung to the grass around the courthouse lawn, where yesterday's rally banners still drooped from their poles, damp and motionless. Cars passed quietly on Main Street, the way they do on a Sunday morning. Though it wasn't Sunday at all, at May's Diner, where gossip usually flowed faster than coffee, every booth told the same story: the rally, the veteran, the senator's smirk. The moment when laughter froze and decency walked back into the room. Someone replayed a shaky cell phone video, the sound of one woman's voice. That's enough. Each time the diners went still. Then came the part where the veteran stood, cane trembling, and the crowd followed like a rising tide. By sunrise, that clip had left Cedar Falls and circled the globe. News banners read, "Crowd stands for mocked veteran. A lesson in respect goes viral. Grace under fire in small-town America." Cable hosts debated it, some praising, some politicizing. But here, in this quiet town of brick storefronts and two stoplight streets, it wasn't politics. It was personal. People felt a lump in their throats remembering how they'd laughed before realizing what they were laughing at. Others felt proud that when it mattered, they had stood. And all of them, every last one, felt that something in the air had shifted, like a curtain drawn back from conscience. Meanwhile, at the edge of town, James Hollis sat on his porch. His coffee steamed in a chipped mug. His old dog Scout dozed by the steps. He hadn't turned on the TV. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of yesterday in the stillness around him, the strange calm that comes when truth has already spoken, and no one dares disturb it. By late morning, the world arrived on his gravel road. News vans lined the ditch. Microphones glinted in the sunlight. A young reporter called out, "Mr. Hollis, can we talk?" He sighed, set his mug on the railing, and stepped forward. He looked nothing like the image already splashed across headlines. There was no heroic pose, no spotlight, just a middle-aged man in a flannel shirt who'd rather be fixing carburetors. "Sir," another voice shouted, "how does it feel to be America's hero?" James shook his head. "I'm no hero," he said evenly. "Just someone who showed up." Questions flew. "What message do you have for Senator Morton? Do you forgive him?" He paused, eyes thoughtful. "There's nothing to forgive. We all say things we shouldn't. What matters is what we learn after." The simplicity stunned them. In a world addicted to outrage, this quiet mercy felt radical. Clips of his answer raced across screens within hours. "Respect is earned by how we treat one another." The line trended on every platform. Teachers wrote it on whiteboards. Veterans groups printed it on banners. Even late-night hosts ended their monologues by quoting it before fading to black. Commentators called it the sentence that healed a headline. But inside his house, James returned to ordinary life. He fixed the porch hinge, fed Scout, and ignored the ringing phone. He hadn't meant to start anything. He had only refused to lose his dignity. That refusal had become a mirror, one the whole country now stared into. 200 miles away, Senator Morton sat in his office, curtains drawn. The video played again and again on the muted television across the room. Each replay felt like a punch. His own laugh, the crowd's uneasy chuckle, the veteran's stillness. He couldn't escape it. Advisors filled the hallway, whispering about strategy. "Call it a misunderstanding. Blame the edit. Release a statement quickly." Morton waved them off. His voice was hoarse. "No statements," he said. Not yet. For 2 days he stayed silent. And in that silence, the country's opinion hardened. People wanted remorse, not defense. On the third night, he appeared before a single camera. No rally backdrop, no cheering crowd. His tie was plain navy, his notes handwritten. "I disrespected a man who served his country. My words were careless and cruel. Mr. Hollis showed more strength in silence than I did in speech. I can't undo what I said, but I can own it. I was wrong." The apology lasted barely 2 minutes. Yet it reverberated louder than any campaign slogan he'd ever shouted. Later, he wrote a letter in pen and ink, something he hadn't done in years. "Dear Mr. Hollis, I saw the look in your eyes when I joked at your expense. I will carry that look longer than any election result. You reminded me that respect isn't a performance. It's a choice. I hope one day to earn back even a fraction of the dignity you showed me." He mailed it without a return address. He never expected a reply. That perhaps was his first act of humility. Weeks turned into months, yet the story refused to fade. It stopped being news and started being history. A documentary crew arrived in Cedar Falls, capturing slow pans of the empty stage, the rusting banners, and interviews with townsfolk who still spoke about that day, as though it had happened yesterday. Schools across the country added the clip to civics lessons. Children watched the moment the crowd rose, and teachers asked, "Why did they stand?" Hands went up. "Because it was right," said one. "Because nobody told them to," said another. Veterans organizations invited James to speak, but he declined every time. Instead, he wrote a short note for them to read aloud. "You don't have to wear a uniform to serve with honor." Sometimes standing quietly for what's right is service enough. Meanwhile, Senator Morton's political career dimmed. He still held office, but the rallies were smaller, the applause more restrained. Yet privately he changed. He began visiting veterans' hospitals unannounced. No cameras, no speeches, just listening. Once a nurse caught him wiping his eyes at a bedside. He looked up and whispered, "He's about the same age as Hollis." Back in Cedar Falls, life carried on. The auto shop smelled of oil and coffee as always. James worked half days now. His limp a little slower, his patience a little deeper. Visitors came from across the country, teachers, veterans, teenagers, just to shake his hand. He'd smile, shake theirs back, and say, "You already know what to do. Keep being kind." Every July, the town renamed Rally Day the Day of Respect. No speeches, no slogans, just music, food, and a minute of silence at noon. During that silence, you could almost hear it again. The single voice saying, "That's enough," and the murmur of hundreds rising in answer. Years rolled by like pages turning in a gentle breeze. Children who'd been in strollers that day grew up hearing the story as folklore. They knew the image by heart. An aging veteran, a humbled politician, a town rediscovering itself. James Hollis grew older, his hair silver, his steps slower. He still lived in the same house, still fixed small engines for neighbors who couldn't afford repairs. When thanked, he'd wave a hand. "Don't make a fuss." He never talked about the rally except once to a high school reporter writing for the local paper. She asked what he thought people should remember most. He smiled, eyes distant. "That it wasn't about me," he said. "It was about everyone remembering they had a choice to be kind or cruel. That's all any of us ever really choose." When he passed away quietly one autumn night, the news didn't break instantly this time. Cedar Falls heard first. The town gathered for a small service on the courthouse lawn, the same ground where everything had begun. No microphones, no cameras. Just neighbors, children, and veterans standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the fading evening light. The woman who had once called out, "That's enough," Carla Reeves, stepped forward, holding a folded flag. She read aloud the words James had written years before. "Respect is earned by how we treat one another." Her voice trembled, but she finished, and the crowd echoed the line softly until it became a whisper carried by the wind. Afterward, as the sun slipped behind the hills, a filmmaker who'd come to record the memorial spoke into his microphone. History doesn't always shift in parliaments or protests. Sometimes it bends in a small town when ordinary people remember their decency. The film later ended on a shot of the empty square, flags swaying gently, the last chords of a lone trumpet fading into evening. Time passed, but the echo refused to die. In classrooms, the quote still hung above chalkboards. In households, parents repeated it when teaching their children to apologize. And every now and then, when a public figure crossed a line and laughter turned uneasy, somewhere, always somewhere, someone would stand and say, "That's enough." The room would fall silent. The memory of Cedar Falls would stir like an old song everyone somehow still knew. Because dignity, once awakened, never truly sleeps again. The closing narration, spoken softly over piano, would say, "Real strength isn't loud. It doesn't demand applause or revenge. Stands steady, humble, unshaken, and reminds the rest of us who we are." James Hollis didn't win an argument. He reminded a nation of its heart, and that in the end is the only kind of victory that lasts. Fade to black. Wind, faint applause, then silence. The story of James Hollis isn't just about one man, one mistake, or one rally. It's about what happens when we forget the weight of our words and what happens when we remember. In a world that moves too fast and where outrage is entertainment and kindness is seen as weakness, one quiet veteran reminded us of something timeless. That respect isn't granted by position or rank or a microphone. It's earned moment by how we treat one another when no one's watching. He didn't fight back with anger. He didn't demand revenge. He simply stood, Steady, calm, and dignified, and the world followed. That's the kind of power that lasts. The kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard, because strength isn't in dominance. It's in restraint, in choosing decency over ego, humility over pride, humanity over spectacle. The crowd that day didn't just stand for a man, they stood for an idea that maybe, deep down, we still know how to be good, that we can still recognize dignity when we see it, that even after years of noise, cynicism, and division, empathy still has a voice, and sometimes, all it takes to awaken that voice is one person saying, softly but firmly, that's enough. So wherever you are, whoever you are, remember this: respect doesn't live in speeches. It lives in small acts, the ones that cost nothing but mean everything. When you see cruelty disguised as humor, when arrogance overshadows compassion, when laughter comes at someone else's expense, you don't have to fight. You don't have to shout. You can simply stand, because every time someone stands for kindness, the world shifts a little closer to what it was always meant to be. And that is the real legacy of James Hollis. Not the headlines, not the viral clip, but the quiet truth that still echoes long after the applause fades. Respect is earned by how we treat one another. Dignity doesn't shout. It stands.